When I was a toddler, something happened to me that set patterns of shame and hesitation in me that have rippled for decades. And ironically, resulted in me cutting off some of the parts of myself that I value the most. Welcome back. My name is Andrew. I help people find inner freedom. And in this video, I'm going to share the steps that I took to heal my inner child. This is an ongoing process. I wouldn't say my inner child is completely healed, but through some steps I'm going to share with you in a process called IFS, which we'll get into in a little bit, I've discovered a real genuine appreciation for parts of myself that previously I had felt ashamed of and wanted to distance myself from. And I've come to develop sort of a natural self love out of appreciating these parts of myself that I had previously abandoned. And today I'm going to guide you through that journey and show you how you can do the same. And what we're going to talk about in this video is sometimes called shadow work, sometimes called parts work. It touches on IFS, which we're going to talk about, inner child healing. All sort of these aspects of the same thing are addressing our subconscious constraints and beliefs about ourselves, recontextualizing them and bringing them into the light of consciousness so that we can do something with them, so that we can become aware of our own programming, and by doing that, we can begin to shift or develop a new sort of appreciation for ourselves. And by the way, what I'm going to share today is probably not what most people would typically consider severe trauma. It's very unlikely to trigger anybody who's watching. And that's actually important to mention as well, because oftentimes when we are little kids, things can happen that have pretty profound psychological effects on us, but they don't even have to be really that bad, because of course they're being interpreted by a little kid, right? So to start off, let's jump into a very brief overview of what the inner child is and what IFS is. Let's say you're 3, 4 years old, right? You're developing an identity, you're developing a sense of self, and you're also simultaneously incorporating information about the world to sort of build a worldview, your framework to understand reality, right? So I've said in other videos, you kind of learn cats meow, dogs bark, and I do these things. This is how I relate to my parents. This is how the world works. And in a lot of ways, this is good. This is how kids learn. We soak up so much information because we are learning machines as little kids, right? Where this becomes problematic is that some of the ways in which we learn to see the world, that framework, our schema for viewing reality, can be not incredibly accurate once we reach adulthood. And it can, in fact, become detrimental. Perhaps there are certain patterns or ways you acted as a kid to survive, get your needs met. You need to survive. You adapt to this situation to make sure you don't die. Those same patterns can be useful as adults, but they can often become sort of these automatic compulsions that we act out over and over. We don't really know why. We just notice we always date the same kind of person. We always feel the same kind of anxiety. We always make the same kind of mistakes. I am this type of person, we say. Well, what makes us that type of person? It's a combination of our genetic factors, but also our environment that we were raised in and how that taught us who we are. So when we talk about inner child healing, we're really talking about going back to understand and recontextualize those ways we learn to be, those perhaps literal neural circuits where we got used to thinking and reacting in certain ways as kids that are now no longer useful to us. What can happen is we can be adults with tons of resources, tons of ingenuity, tons of, possibility, but we still live in the same box that we grew up in because we think that's who we are. So inner child healing is re-examining, recontextualizing, and freeing ourselves from these old patterns that no longer serve us. And IFS, inner family systems, is sort of a slightly more complicated way of looking at the inner child and rather looking at it as an inner family, a collection of different ways we learn to be in different contexts. It is a therapy modality developed by a guy named Richard Schwartz. Tons of information about him online if you're curious. IFS makes things slightly more distinct than inner child work because you could have theoretically multiple inner children. These are patterns that learn to behave different ways, multiple parts as they are called in IFS. So for instance, you might have a child part that wants to be fun and loving, but a protector part, which learned that, when you were too open as a little kid, you got hurt, people were upset at you, whatever the case might be. So it said, oh, don't do that, it's not safe. So your protector part is trying to protect your child part, but they're ultimately different sub sort of genres of this inner child or this inner dynamic wherein we are acting out past patterns we learn to survive it usually in childhood. With that cursory explanation out of the way, let me jump into my story, right? So, this took place when I was like 3 or 4. I was very young, and we were at my great grandparents' house. And we did not spend a tremendous amount of time with my great grandparents on my mom's side of the family, which now that I think about it is maybe for the best because well, we'll get to that. I was 3 or 4 and we were there with some of my, I guess they would be like my second cousins, my mom's cousins' children. And as I said, I was very young. They were a selection of boys. I think there was 4 boys and they were maybe like 5 to 11, right? So still very young, but older than I was. So we were all playing in the backyard and there was this koi pond. And the way I remember it, at least from perhaps my slightly traumatized perspective, is that these other boys were kind of hyping me up saying, oh, I should jump in the koi pond and it would be cool. And I was like 3, right? So your boy jumped into the koi pond. I emerged from this koi pond, like dripping wet and feeling sort of momentarily triumphant, like, yes, I jumped in, I did it. And was immediately met by like pointing and laughing, ah ha ha, you're so stupid. And all of these boys who I had been trying, I guess, to impress or fit in with, all of a sudden were making fun of me and pointing and laughing and like saying to the adults, oh, Andrew jumped into the pond, he's so stupid. And even some of the adults there, like my second aunts and uncles or whoever they were, I don't know, I was 3, had this kind of disapproval, like laughing at me moment. And as a little kid, right, that felt very isolating, shame inducing. I felt like so embarrassed, so humiliated, and really like cut off from the group, right? Like I had been trying to fit in, and all of a sudden, I'm the odd one out. I'm the stupid one. Everybody's pointing and laughing. Now, what I discovered recently was a newfound appreciation through doing some of this inner child work. What I realized was that there's parts of me that I really value that were present in this dynamic. And perhaps they didn't present themselves in the best way. And you might think, well, okay, come on, like, why do you remember that? That's not such a big deal. And it's true that the exact mechanism of this experience was not really that bad. I jumped into a pond, like it's not like anybody was like physically abusing me. And yet, I feel that the deep sort of felt separation, the humiliation, the shame really imprinted in a very young version of me to not do anything that would ruffle feathers too much, to make people happy, to not act out or risk embarrassment in front of a crowd or in front of the group. And I found a sort of hesitation as an adult for things that I know I could do. But I find like this inner voice that says, it's not safe. You can't do that. What if something goes wrong? What if you make a fool of yourself? What if blah, 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 right? And for me, I found a lot of freedom in recontextualizing that through some IFS work, through some inner child work, which we're going to talk about just in a little bit. I'm going to give you the steps I did. But what I discovered through that process, right, was wait a second, there's also this other aspect of me that I have struggled to express because I have such a strong inner self censor now. I have an inner voice that says it's not safe, don't try it, stay small. Inner saboteur, if you will. And what I realized was that there's also this a part of me that is very adventurous. There's very impulsive, very outgoing that I deeply value. I love to travel. I love to make it up when I go as I travel. I went to Asia with a backpack and I was there for 2 months and I had no plan other than just winging it. And I love doing that from time to time. I love experiencing new things, which is very much at odds, right, with the part of me that is hesitant and fearful. What I realized was that hesitation and fear comes in many ways from maybe perhaps not only this experience, but this and other childhood experiences, which gave my inner child the idea that it was shameful to do something that the crowd didn't like, that it was painful and harmful to jump, into a new situation where I didn't know what was going to happen. It was met with pain, with isolation, with like humiliation. And what I realized is that I deeply value that part of myself. And through this process, wherein I went back and sort of communicated with this part of myself, One thing that came up was the part just really wanted to be liked. When I talked to that part of myself, which we'll get to, the it just said I really wanted them to like me, which cut me pretty deep and made me tear up a little bit to work through and realize that the dynamic of just being a little kid, 3 or 4, and trying to fit into a peer group and feeling completely betrayed, humiliated, shamed for ultimately, I guess, being tricked into doing something, um, is pretty intense on a little kid. And that really did cut me pretty deep. I remember it. Now, it's like 25 years ago, which is not common. I don't remember a lot from that time frame. But what I discovered was, wait a second. As silly as this might sound, I really value the part of me that jumped into that pond. I think that's cool. I love that a part of me was willing to jump into a koi pond. Now, maybe that's not like, practical in most cases, but it showed a willingness on 3 or 4 year old Andrew's part to jump, to leap into the unknown, quite literally, and to just go for it and not know how it was going to turn out. But I still did it, and until everybody pointed and laughed, I felt good about it. I was excited. Yes, I did it. Then I looked, everybody's pointing and laughing, and that's when 3 year old me made the judgment that this was not okay. Oh, I made a mistake. I did something wrong because of everybody else's reaction. But my internal state prior to that was fine. I was like, yes, I did it. This is cool. I'm in the fish pond now, as every 3 year old wants to be. And what I realized was a deep appreciation for that part of me that I had exiled for a long time. I learned the lesson, or so it felt in that moment, like that was not okay. It was not okay for me to be that way. But as an adult, I deeply value those traits. Of course, I probably won't jump in any fish ponds anytime soon, but that adventurousness or that impulsiveness, that exploratory nature was sort of slammed shut. The door was sort of slammed in its face. And I realized that I deeply love that part of myself. And yet I have been telling myself for years the inner self censor, which was built in that place, the defensive mechanism, has said, no, you can't do that. That's not good. That's terrible. That'll get you shamed. There's so much pain on the other side of opening up like that and being exploratory, being adventurous, that despite the times I have done it, I still can find myself self-sabotaging about it. And self-sabotage is exactly where we're going to transition this into how you can start this same process. So, from the IFS perspective, which we talked a little bit about before, we're going to start with what's called a protector. So, this is the mechanism you develop to defend yourself, your inner child, to keep your inner child safe. So, let's say in that situation, my inner child was the more open, honest, innocent part that was like, yeah, hell yeah, I'll jump into a fish pond, I don't care. Whereas the protector mechanism is the part that I learned, the adaptive brain circuit that says, hold on, what you just did is unacceptable because it was met with shame and humiliation and pain. And, evolutionarily, that's the kind of thing that gets you killed. So let's not upset the tribe. Fit in, don't ever do that again. That's the sort of the evolutionary learning that comes up in result of that, right? So when we start this process towards inner child healing, it's very commonly useful for us to start not actually by trying to connect directly with the lost sort of innocence, but to connect with the part that we probably want to think of the least, or we want to avoid the most, which is our inner critic, our inner parts that tell us what not to do, the things that berate us or tell us we suck or we can't do it or we're worthless or whatever. Because as hard as it might be to believe, what those parts actually are doing, what that voice internally is actually for, is to keep you safe. Now, it doesn't really care if you're miserable because it just doesn't want you to die, right? And so the messaging that I got in jumping into that pond was that was not safe. What you got was emotionally not safe. You were isolated from the group you wanted to fit into. They made fun of you. You got cut off from the peer group. Even the adults, the tribal elders or whatever, were kind of laughing at you, pointing it out. And I should highlight that for years after the fact, every time I would interact with those people, they'd be like, hey, the fish pond kid, ha ha ha. And they'd have a little chuckle about it. Not like mean-spirited, but just like, for them, it was sort of funny. For me, I hated it every time they brought it up. Surprise, surprise. Point being, the adapted learning is don't do that again ever. So, what that translates into is every time that I then think about doing something that could push that boundary, now there's a learned response, right? That says, hold on. You're not good enough to do that. Don't even think about it. That's going to be bad. It's going to be unsafe. You're going to get hurt. Why bother? It's not worth it. That is our inner critic, our inner saboteur, the part of us that might berate ourselves, dislike ourselves, and it might be the part that we dislike about ourselves. But really, from that context, it often forms in the case of, well, it's trying to keep us safe. It's an adaptive mechanism we learned as a little kid to survive certain circumstances that did not feel good. And because that protector wants to keep us safe, and you might have multiple protectors, by the way, but because a protector wants to keep you safe, it's actually on your side in a strange, twisted sort of way. It might not feel like that at all, but ultimately it wants what's best for you. And this is where this might start to seem a little like woo-woo for most people, but if you go with it, I can promise you, you'll almost definitely have results. I guess I can't actually promise you you'll have results, but it's worked very well for me and a lot of other people as well. And essentially what you do is have a dialogue with yourself. You connect and communicate with these isolated parts of you, starting with your protectors, the defending parts, the parts that might even attack you a little bit. Ask that part of yourself, see if you can muster up some curiosity. What does it need to defend? What's so important? Where is it coming from? What is it protecting you from? And I would recommend before you dive too deeply into this, have like a journal ready or something to take down notes and then see what this part has to say and ask curious questions. What is it going for? What does it need from you? And actually, because you're watching this video, I've created a free little sheet that you can download that has some questions and a basic framework for this process. You can find that in the description. But basically what you want to do is just ask this part, where it's coming from. What tension is it holding? Where does it feel like its responsibilities lie? And what we'll find is that often these defensive parts feel like they are maintaining a tremendous burden. They are carrying a huge weight on their shoulders. And so when I investigated my own inner critic, which was the part saying, you can't do this, it's too dangerous, it's too scary, it's whatever, right? What comes up is, on the other side of that, it feels like it's protecting me from isolation, death, just shame, pain, everything awful. Well, it's like, well, where did you get that idea? How did that come about? But what you realize is that these parts that might seem very destructive feel actually like they have the pretty rough job that nobody wants. They feel kind of like Atlas holding up the whole world in Greek mythology, and everybody's sort of just mad at them, and they're like, can you see this weight I'm carrying? They're trying to keep you from dying, ultimately. And often, these parts of us feel very young because we learn these adaptive mechanisms, remember, when we are kids. So you might learn when you're 3 or 4 to behave a certain way. That part catalyzes that you have to solve this problem with a 3 or 4-year-old's mentality. So it feels all of a sudden like a very overwhelmed little kid trying to fight the world with no resources. But when you approach these parts with curiosity rather than judgment, be surprised. They might open up. Ask how old this part is, when it learned that it had to act this way, what it's trying to protect, what it's on the line. And you might be surprised what comes up. Also, it might just want to vent a whole bunch of anger at you. So be prepared for that as well. If you've had severe trauma happen in your life, you might want to work through this with a therapist, just because it might be overwhelming at first. This is essentially pulling back the lid and looking at all the stuff we've been pushing down for a long time. And so if you've had a history of severe trauma or abuse or PTSD or anything like that, it may be helpful to have a support system in the form of a therapist or just even like a really good friend, somebody to help you through the process, right? To go step by step and sort of make sure that you process everything in a good way as it comes up, just so you don't get too overwhelmed. The goal being, at the end, you can develop a new appreciation for yourself. Like I said, I really learned that my protector part, firstly, was carrying this huge burden. And no wonder it was so overwhelmed. No wonder I was so frustrated in this feeling. And then the part that it was trying to protect was this innocent little child that wanted to be adventurous and courageous, but felt like it was met with a punch in the face from reality for doing so and learned that that was not safe. And what I realized is that I so much value those parts of myself that I have been now perpetuating the separation from. That's the ultimate irony, is that once we learn these ways to adapt, the world teaches us that's not okay. Now we become the internal enforcers. My own self censorship now tells me that my independence is bad, that my adventuresomeness, is that a word, is bad. There's a part of me that self censors, that self rejects when I would otherwise go for it. I want to go do this. It's too dangerous, too hard, whatever. That's the learned adapted response telling me that I'm not good enough. Ironically, that's the internalized version of what those boys were in the past. It's the same thing, but now I'm the one doing it, which is good in a way because that means we can see it and realize that, wait a second, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So the protector is trying to protect the exile, which is the part of us that we have cut off through that whole system I just described. For most people, starting with the protector is probably as far as it'll go for the first time you try it, so that's completely fine. If in your first attempt or first 5 attempts at this, you're only able to connect with the protector, that's okay, because remember, we've received a lot of reinforcement that that protector has a very strong role and it needs to protect. It thinks life is on the line, so it is often viciously opposed to you just going in and trying to undo this whole system because the whole system feels like it's necessary to survive. So by starting with understanding, acknowledging the weight of that protector, it might feel weird to take the part of yourself that self-sabotages and think, yeah, I can see that you feel like there's so much weight on your shoulders. I can see that you feel like there's just this impossible job. It might feel hard to be curious about that part of yourself because you probably dislike it. But if you have the capacity to be curious and authentically interested, you might discover that it's not actually your enemy. The exile, then, for those who do want to go a little bit further, once you've gotten the permission of your protector parts, to really realize and recontextualize some of those childhood experiences is sort of the next step. To look at the opportunities that that part had to express itself as a kid that were not met with the situation it needed. The times it was pushed down or shoved or told that it didn't matter or that what it wanted wasn't important. What you wanted wasn't important. And how that might have affected you and how that might still affect you. And in that process, there's a lot of healing to be had. There's a lot of healing to be had with reconnecting with the protector as well. But in reconnecting with the exiled parts of ourselves, we start to find those parts that we once deemed valuable, that we have been suppressing. And how ironic that we suppress parts of ourselves that we value. We love them, but we don't feel safe to express them. So that creates this inner conflict where I would love to be this way, but it feels scary because I have the defense mechanism that tells me I can't. The authentic expression of who I am becomes compromised by these conditioned factors. And as part of this whole process, you can find those traumatic moments, your version of the koi pond, and recontextualize it. Find out what part of this did I not receive the adult support I needed? What part of this wasn't fair? What part of this made me feel like I was other or not good enough or couldn't be something? And maybe did I overreact in my childlike self's takeaway? Did I learn something that might not fundamentally be true? Did I learn that something that might only be true in this situation that I'm applying to this broad context, the whole of my future? I can never be that way again. Is that true? And what is that costing you? What are you leaving behind that you once cherished? For me, there's so much authenticity, so much openness, so much innocence, even in just jumping for it, just going for it, metaphorically, physically, literally, the ability to just jump into a new situation. I deeply admire that child part that had that courage. It might have been kind of stupid, but it was still very courageous, very just in the moment, free flowing. Hey, let's go for it. And as an adult, that's something I have felt I lacked. And through this whole process, I've realized that I'm the one telling me that I can't be that way. And that is the way that I was naturally. So, how ironic for me to want to build something that I already was, for me to want to try to be more something that I already actually was. It's more about realizing that I'm pumping the brakes, and I can recontextualize that through conversing and communing with that defensive part. We can sort of come back a step and get a different perspective on the whole thing, which can be very freeing. And through that process, I developed a whole new appreciation for myself that I never had before. And I realized how much I love that I jumped in that koi pond. And if I happen to bump into any of those people again, they're like, "You're the kid from the koi pond." I'm going to be like, "Damn right. Yeah, I am." Because I'm proud of that kid now. When in the past I viewed that kid as a failure, somebody who did something wrong, who made a huge mistake that was costly and should never have happened. What an idiot. But no, actually, wait a second. I didn't really do anything that wrong. It wasn't that big of a deal, and actually, I kind of like the fact that I jumped in because it's fun. Why not? And the goal of this whole process is to recontextualize these memories and these aspects of yourself, right? And to realize that you have more power now than you did then, and the limits that you built into your system might not really exist in the way that they seem to. They may have once existed that way, and it's very harmful. It's very hurtful to admit that, you know what, sometimes we did have to be that way. There was a time in my life where I probably needed to stay small and not take any risks and not do anything dangerous to feel safe. It just wasn't okay with the environment I was in. But that's not a universal template that can be applied to reality. And when it starts to become a sort of compulsive thing, we look at the world and see through this lens, it can become very destructive. So by re-examining and opening ourselves to ourselves, we can sort of rebalance this whole thing and update our view of reality. Make sure that these parts know how old you are. In the IFS protocol, they talk about how these parts are frozen in time, so they might still be acting as if you're 3 or 4. My 3 or 4 year old part feels like it's freaking dangerous to make a move because God knows what's going to happen out there. But when my 29-year-old part says, "I got you, buddy. I will take care of you." And you know what? If 29-year-old Andrew was in that situation and saw that kid jump into the pond, I'd go clean him off and I'd give him a fist bump. "Good job, buddy. That was cool. Was that fun? Maybe not a fish pond next time, but hey, let's go to a lake. Jump in. Have fun. With a life jacket, I guess, because you're 3. But point stands, right? That you can develop a new appreciation for the way you were authentically at that time, which might not have been granted to you in the moment. It might have been judged as negative by others, but you can reevaluate that on your own terms. And what that does is it kind of shifts the takeaway a little bit. It shifts the value equation a little bit. It's not necessarily an instant cure, but it's part of an ongoing process of reevaluating your relationship with yourself. Because these patterns have deep ramifications. I mean, we're talking about something so simple as just like a random time I jumped into a koi pond and some people made fun of me. It's really not that big of a deal. But I have noticed like a line in my life where there's things that actually I think were significantly affected by this or similar experiences. Metaphorically, there have been plenty of times in my life where I have felt afraid to jump into a new situation, afraid to leave the known, and there's a sort of terror that can rise up that I'll be met with like humiliation or utter failure and rejection, even when it doesn't make sense. And I always wondered, like, why do I feel that way? And this might be part of it. Maybe it's not the only part. It's part of that ongoing journey. I'm discovering more and recontextualizing more. But what I realized is that I am proud of myself for jumping into that koi pond. And there are probably things that you went through as a little kid that you might even be viewing as negative, that might be impacting the way you view the world, that might be really very practically limiting you in this moment, that aren't real, and in fact are things that you could be proud of, that you could love about yourself, that you are currently hating about yourself. And that's powerful. That's a meaningful shift that I think more of us need to sort of experience and express and work through. In that document I mentioned earlier that I'll provide below, I'll be sure to add a little bit more concrete steps because I realize this video might be a little bit free flowy for most people. Some people might enjoy how this was presented, but if you do want a little bit more concrete of an approach for your first attempt, then that will be in the document in the description. And I'll also toss down a couple links to more information about IFS, the Interfamily Systems approach, and Richard Schwartz, who has great books that you can check out. I'll put those in the description as well. Aside from that, just remember that, you know, there are small things that we go through that seem small, at least when we were very young. But a small thing to a small person seems like a big thing. And so you don't necessarily have to have been super traumatized as a kid. And we also don't necessarily have to spend our whole lives thinking about our childhood trauma. The reason that this is so meaningful is it's not necessarily about dredging up the past just to live it over and over and over. It's about reconciling the past, to resolve the things, to bring these open circles to completion so that we can put them behind us. I like to say that, you know, an open loop in our mind is actually like a hook. You know, it's something that can snag onto us and drag us back. Whereas if we are able to go back and sort of close those loops, to give them new meaning and set them in place so they're no longer these open ended stories, close them and set them behind us as they should be, as they really are. They are behind us. Then they lose the ability to hook into us. And that's what I want for you, and that's what I want for all of us, really, myself included, selfishly, as we go through this process, is to really just reconcile these wounds and learn that we are more than we think we are. And it's not always even a process of becoming more. It's a process of uncovering that authentic energy that we once had and we have perhaps lost. Give yourself the gift of reevaluating your story, reconnecting with yourself, and appreciating those parts of yourself that you do value because they're there and they're great and they should be. And you deserve to express them, and the world often needs you to be that way, to let that light shine. That's what I want for all of you. That's what I want for me. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.